Before spoons became the quiet little servants of soup and cereal, they were sacred, tools of ceremony, not breakfast. And their story begins long before stainless steel. In temples, tombs, and kitchens that smelled faintly of smoke, honey, and the occasional goat. Picture it, ancient Egypt, around 1500 BCE. The Nile is gleaming in the morning light, and somewhere near a palace courtyard, a craftsman sits carving a small, shallow bowl from ivory. He's not making cutlery, he's making a prayer. The spoon he shapes will be used to mix ointments for the gods, to scoop perfumes for the dead, and to remind mortals that even the act of stirring something can be a ritual. Egyptian spoons weren't just tools, they were declarations of faith. Their handles were carved with lotus flowers, animals, and tiny inscriptions asking the gods for good harvests, long life, or fewer crocodiles. Some were buried with priests, others placed inside tombs to help the soul eat properly in the afterlife. Imagine dying and still worrying about tableware. Now that's dedication. Centuries later, across the Aegean, the Greeks took a simpler approach. Their spoons were bronze and practical, though they occasionally doubled as medical instruments, which raises questions about how appetizing dinner was. Romans followed suit, refining the shape, a small bowl, a slender handle, and gave it a name, cochlea, after the spiral shell that inspired it. They used them for sauces, medicines, and gossip. Because in Rome, you didn't just eat with a spoon, you gestured with it. If your spoon waved too enthusiastically, someone probably owed you money. Then came the Middle Ages, a time when most people didn't own a spoon at all. Each person carried their own, like medieval cutlery adventurers. Traveling merchants had spoons on chains, nobles wore silver ones engraved with family crests, and peasants carved theirs from wood. It was less table setting and more BYOs, bring your own spoon. But even in this mud-splattered world, spoons had status. To gift someone a spoon was to offer friendship, trust, and a subtle reminder not to lick both sides. In weddings, spoons symbolized unity, two halves of one bowl. Christenings came with apostle spoons, each topped with a tiny saint. The godparents would pick one and say, "May this child be fed by faith," which, while poetic, didn't help much during the Black Death. Of course, not everyone loved the idea of eating from a curved piece of metal. There were skeptics. One medieval scholar described spoons as vain devices of comfort, which sounds like something written by a man who had never tried soup. Others worried that luxury utensils encouraged gluttony. The church, in its endless campaign to make dinner more difficult, occasionally condemned ornate spoons as symbols of pride. Meanwhile, the rich kept collecting them anyway, engraving them, gilding them, and losing them to servants with sticky fingers. The spoon even found its way into folklore. In England, to share a spoon meant to share a bed. Apparently, spooning was already a thing centuries before modern romance discovered it. In Scotland, blacksmiths made love spoons for courting couples, their handles carved with hearts, anchors, and keys. Each shape meant something: a heart for affection, a key for home, a wheel for a long journey together. If the woman accepted the spoon, she accepted the man, and probably hoped he could also afford a chair. And then there was the superstition. Drop a spoon, they said, and a visitor would arrive. Lay it upside down, and misfortune would follow. Stir your tea counterclockwise, and the devil himself might pop in to discuss your manners. Spoons became tiny weather vanes of fate, part utensil, part horoscope, part anxiety management system. Yet through all that, they endured. From golden altars to wooden huts, the spoon followed humanity's appetite and imagination. It bridged the sacred and the silly. It fed gods, kings, and toddlers. And if civilization is measured by the ability to bring liquid to one's mouth without spilling, then the spoon is the true beginning of progress. So next time you eat cereal at midnight or scrape the last bit of peanut butter from the jar, take a moment to appreciate the craftsmanship, not just of metal and design, but of centuries of faith, art, and minor chaos. Because the humble spoon, once carved for gods and buried with pharaohs, is still doing what it always did, stirring up a little bit of wonder in the ordinary. If the spoon was born from reverence, the fork was born from rebellion, a tiny, two-pronged act of defiance against the tyranny of greasy fingers. For most of human history, eating was a hands-on experience, literally. Ancient Egyptians used flat bread to scoop food, Romans stabbed things with knives, and medieval nobles simply plunged in with enthusiasm and hierarchy. Everyone had a knife hand, a bread hand, and, depending on social class, a wipe-it-on-the-dog hand. Then, somewhere in the glittering chaos of Byzantium around the 11th century, a princess named Theodora Dukaina decided she'd had enough of touching her dinner. She arrived at her wedding feast in Venice with a small golden instrument that scandalized an entire continent. It had two dainty prongs. She used it, brace yourself, to lift bits of food to her mouth without getting sauce on her fingers. The guests gasped. The priests clutched their rosaries. The local chroniclers, who never missed a chance to overreact, declared it an insult to God's design. Because apparently, if God had wanted you to use forks, he wouldn't have given you hands. When Theodora died young, possibly of plague, possibly of bad reviews, some monks claimed her death was divine punishment for her sinful cutlery. The fork was cursed. And so Europe, having glimpsed the future of dining, promptly decided to eat like barbarians for another 400 years. But the idea didn't die. It just waited. Forks kept popping up quietly in Italy, where they were used to twirl pasta long before TikTok invented tutorials. They were delicate, elegant, a little too civilized for the rest of Europe's taste. French and English travelers saw them, scoffed, and returned home bragging about how they used fingers like real men. Meanwhile, Italian nobles were eating spaghetti without looking like they'd survived a food fight. By the Renaissance, manners were evolving. Napkins appeared. Plates stopped doubling as cutting boards. And someone, somewhere realized that a fork wasn't just practical. It was power. It let you control the meal. It gave you time to talk, to smile, to pretend you weren't inhaling your food. Soon, owning a fork became a statement. Silver ones for nobles, wooden ones for merchants, and for peasants. Still fingers, though occasionally a sharpened stick if you felt fancy. By the 1600s, the fork had spread across Europe, thanks mostly to trade, marriage alliances, and the universal desire not to look ridiculous at banquets. France adopted it first. Of course they did. Then England grudgingly followed. When King Charles II returned from exile in France, he brought a collection of forks with him and, with royal enthusiasm, announced that it is uncivilized to touch meat with one's hands. The aristocracy sighed, rolled their eyes, and bought forks anyway. The church, having lost the utensil war, rebranded the fork as a symbol of refinement, rather than Satan's salad tongs. And soon, the table setting became a performance. Forks on the left, knives on the right, and an entire etiquette industry devoted to reminding you which one to use for fish, dessert, or existential dread. Even the design evolved. 2 prongs became 3, then 4, a perfect balance of grip and grace. The curves softened, the handles lengthened, and suddenly humanity was eating like gods, stabbing at peas with precision instead of chasing them around the plate like confused predators. In time, the fork became the quiet symbol of civilization itself, a sign that we had conquered the wild, not by hunting it, but by politely cutting it into manageable pieces. Empires rose and fell, but the fork stayed, patiently waiting beside every plate like a tiny trident of progress. And perhaps that's why we still treat fine dining as a kind of modern ritual. The polished silver, the careful posture, the whisper of cutlery against porcelain, it all traces back to that Byzantine princess who dared to say, "I love you, God, but I'm not touching this stew." So next time someone calls you fancy for using a fork on pizza, just smile knowingly. You're part of a 1,000-year rebellion against the sticky-fingered past. Because civilization, in the end, wasn't built on stone or steel. It was built on the quiet dignity of not needing to lick your hands after dinner. Once upon a time, and by time, I mean somewhere around 3000 BCE, the word pillow meant object that prevents neck injury during the afterlife. Ancient Egyptians were the first known civilization to rest their royal heads on what can only be described as luxury bricks. These headrests were carved from alabaster, ivory, or stone, curved just enough to cradle the neck while keeping elaborate wigs untouched. Comfort was optional. Eternal posture was everything. Picture it. A golden chamber, the air thick with incense and quiet paranoia about snakes. A priest polishes a marble headrest meant for a pharaoh. He isn't thinking about REM cycles. He's thinking about curses. The idea was simple. Raise the head so evil spirits couldn't crawl into your ears while you slept. Essentially, ancient anti-ghost ergonomics. Across the desert, the Mesopotamians had their own version. Wooden blocks that doubled as status symbols. The higher your rank, the harder your pillow. Archaeologists have found some carved with prayers to protect dreams, others decorated with lions and suns. Because nothing says sweet dreams like resting your skull on divine iconography. Then came the Chinese dynasties, who perfected the art of uncomfortable sleeping. They crafted pillows from jade, bronze, and porcelain, objects so cold and solid that they could double as home defense. The logic: soft cushions sapped vitality, while hard ones preserved the spirit. Imagine trying to explain memory foam marketing to that crowd. In ancient Greece and Rome, things finally softened, literally. Wealthy citizens filled linen sacks with feathers, straw, or wool. The poor used whatever was left over: hay, clothes, or a friend's shoulder. Philosophers debated whether softness weakened the body, which is ironic considering most of them also napped during lectures. Fast forward to medieval Europe, where comfort was once again viewed with suspicion. Monks considered pillows sinful indulgences. The harder your bed, the closer you were to God. Rest, they said, invites temptation, which explains both the invention of insomnia and the popularity of confession. The nobility, of course, ignored all of that. By the 14th century, castles were overflowing with embroidered cushions stuffed with goose down and gossip. Pillows became displays of wealth, the medieval equivalent of a sports car. They were covered in velvet, perfumed with herbs, and occasionally monogrammed with someone else's initials. Meanwhile, ordinary folk made do with what they had. Rough cloth filled with seeds, grass, or leftover wool. The smell was agricultural, but they also believed the humble pillow carried magic. Slip a sprig of lavender inside and you dream of your true love. Forget to bless it, and you'd invite witches to your bed. In short, bedtime was a high-risk activity. By the Renaissance, humanity had collectively decided that comfort wasn't a moral failure. Pillows multiplied, for heads, arms, seats, even pets. The Ottoman Empire turned them into furniture. Japanese households perfected the art of precise minimalism. And in France, embroidery reached heights of decadence previously reserved for cathedrals. Then came the Industrial Revolution, bringing with it cotton mills, mass production, and an alarming number of feathers in the average bedroom. Pillows lost their sacred meaning but kept their symbolism. A soft place to rest became a quiet badge of civilization, proof that we'd finally conquered both insomnia and superstition, if not snoring. Yet something of their old mystique remains. We still treat pillows like personal treasures. We hug them when sad, decorate them for guests, and hoard them in numbers that defy both logic and mattress size. And in hospitals, dorm rooms, and royal suites alike, every head seeks that small island of softness between consciousness and dreams. Because even though the Pharaoh's stone headrest has evolved into plush memory foam, the purpose hasn't changed. It's still a guardian of rest, a little monument to the human belief that peace, no matter how fragile, can be engineered. So tonight, as you sink into yours, remember the lineage. You're part of a 5,000-year experiment in pretending rocks were comfortable. And somehow, against all odds, we made it work. If you think world history was shaped by kings, wars, and revolutions, you're right, but only halfway. Because behind every empire, there's usually someone, somewhere, arguing over how long to steep the leaves. The story of the teapot begins, as so many tales of civilization do, in China, where boiling water wasn't a habit, it was survival. Thousands of years before anyone in Europe had figured out that microbes were real and not tiny demons, the Chinese were boiling water for tea. It tasted good, it kept you alive, and it made conversations more interesting. Legend says Emperor Shen Nong, around 2737 BCE, accidentally invented tea when a leaf drifted into his boiling pot of water. Most historians call that a myth, but even if it's half true, it means the world's most beloved drink began because someone forgot to cover their cup, which, in hindsight, feels extremely human. Early tea wasn't brewed in dainty pots or served with biscuits. It was pounded into bricks, boiled into broths, and drunk from bowls big enough to bathe a hamster in. The first teapots were bronze kettles, practical, heavy, and decidedly unromantic. Over centuries, artisans refined them into porcelain vessels that looked like small miracles, smooth, luminous, and strong enough to hold boiling water without cracking. Porcelain was alchemy. Europeans called it white gold. It was beautiful, nearly indestructible, and most importantly, impossible to make outside China for almost 1,000 years. So when merchants and explorers finally stumbled onto tea in the 16th century, they didn't just discover a drink. They discovered an entire economy disguised as a beverage. By the 1600s, tea had sailed westward on the backs of merchants, monks, and pirates. The Dutch East India Company began importing it in secret, because nothing says delicate cultural exchange like armed ships and cannons. Soon, England got a taste, literally, and everything changed. Tea was exotic, it was expensive, it was liquid prestige. People drank it in public to prove they could afford it, and in private to prove they understood it. But there was a problem. Europe had no proper teapots. They tried glass, which shattered. They tried pewter, which flavored everything like regret. Eventually, they begged China for porcelain, and China obliged at a profit so large it could have paid for several small wars, and in fact did. That trade created something quietly revolutionary: global addiction with great manners. Ships sailed from Canton carrying crates of tea, silk and porcelain. They returned loaded with silver, wool and the occasional plague. The teapot became a status symbol, a conversation piece and a household treasure. The wealthiest families displayed them like art, while the poorer ones pretended to have them by painting fake ones on walls. Every pot told a story. Chinese artisans decorated them with dragons, mountains and philosophers. European potters copied them enthusiastically, then added cherubs and farm animals. The result was a glorious cultural misunderstanding that somehow worked: a world united by leaves and boiling water. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Coffee drinkers in Europe scoffed at the trend. Tea, one critic wrote, is suitable only for the sick and the effeminate, which is rich, coming from people who spent their lives shaking from caffeine withdrawal. But tea didn't care. It kept spreading into monasteries, royal courts, and sleepy afternoons everywhere. By the 18th century, it wasn't just a drink, it was an empire in a cup. Britain's love of tea reshaped the world. From colonial plantations in India and Ceylon to the Boston Harbor, where some unhappy taxpayers made a rather wet political statement. Millions of lives and fortunes turned around those tiny porcelain pots, each one a symbol of comfort, conquest, and contradiction. Back home, the ritual grew gentler. Afternoon tea became an institution, a pause in the chaos of industrialization. Teapots sat at the center of tables like tiny anchors, steadying the conversation. They became heirlooms, handed down like stories. A cracked teapot was mended with gold in Japan. Kintsugi, the art of making floors beautiful. And even the simplest clay pot in an English kitchen was treated with near religious devotion, never washed, just rinsed, because a seasoned pot brewed better flavor. Or more accurately, because no one liked doing dishes. The teapot outlived its empires. Porcelain factories collapsed, trade routes shifted, revolutions boiled over. And still, someone somewhere kept pouring tea. In times of war, teapots survived bombings. In times of peace, they overheard gossip. They have listened to more confessions than most priests and comforted more souls than any sermon. Even today, when coffee machines roar and energy drinks sparkle like liquid stress, there's something rebellious about a teapot. It demands patience. You must boil, wait, pour, and sip. You cannot rush tea. It will not be rushed. It is civilization's most polite protest against chaos. So the next time you watch steam curl out of a cup, remember that it's not just a drink rising before you. It's history. Whispering of ships that crossed oceans, potters who burned their hands perfecting porcelain, and empires that rose and fell on the strength of a single soothing habit. The teapot didn't conquer the world through power or fear. It conquered it through calm. And in a world still addicted to urgency, that might be the most revolutionary idea of all. There are a few inventions that changed the course of human history: fire, the wheel, writing, and the humble sock. Yes, the sock. Humanity's small woolly declaration that cold feet are unacceptable. You might laugh, but the story of civilization can be traced, quite literally, through its footwear. Wherever people walked, socks followed, quietly, obediently, collecting centuries of dirt, sweat, and symbolism along the way. Our tale begins, as most great ones do, in ancient Egypt. Archaeologists have discovered woven socks more than 1700 years old, dyed red and stitched with tiny split toes designed for sandals. Because yes, the first sock wearers proudly paired them with open footwear. The look was bold. The message? I'm important enough to protect even my toes from the desert wind. Egyptian socks weren't fashion statements. They were spiritual insurance. Feet were sacred. They touched the dust of the gods. To cover them was an act of respect, not vanity. Many pairs were buried with the dead, ensuring comfort in eternity, or at least until the next excavation. Meanwhile, in Greece and Rome, socks took a turn for the practical. The Greeks called them piloi, made from matted animal hair, basically early felt. Roman soldiers, tired of frozen toes and morale problems, began wrapping their feet in strips of cloth under their sandals. They called them eudons, which roughly translates to stop complaining and march. And so, the first sandal sock controversy was born, an argument still raging today in airports and suburban patios worldwide. As the empire expanded, so did its sock collection. Wool became the fabric of choice, warm, cheap, and when washed incorrectly, a reliable method of self-loathing. By the time the legions reached the chilly frontiers of Britain and Gaul, socks weren't luxuries. They were survival gear. Cold feet, after all, lose wars. When Rome fell, Europe entered its famous "let's forget hygiene for a while" period. But socks soldiered on. Medieval peasants wrapped their feet in rags or scraps of cloth, tied with string. It wasn't elegant, but it kept the frostbite away. The nobility, however, turned the sock into a statement of divine privilege. Their versions, hoses, were silk or fine wool, dyed in impossible colours, sometimes embroidered with family crests or verses about humility, which was ironic, given the price tag. By the 14th century, men's socks reached their peak absurdity. They weren't socks anymore. They were fashion armour, long, tight stockings that clung to the legs like social ambition. If you had shapely calves, you showed them off. If you didn't, you stuffed your hose with linen until you did. Courtly love poetry even included the occasional ode to ankles. It was a weird time. Then, in 1589, a clergyman named William Lee ruined everyone's fun by inventing the knitting machine. Suddenly, socks could be produced faster, tighter, and cheaper. Lee was promptly ignored by Queen Elizabeth I, who declared his invention too perfect and a threat to her beloved hand knitters. But the idea escaped anyway. Across Europe, knitting took over, and soon socks became affordable for the masses. No longer symbols of status, they became symbols of decency. To walk without socks was to invite judgment, and possibly blisters of eternal damnation. In the 18th century, cotton arrived, and socks became soft, breathable, and socially mandatory. Sailors wore them on voyages, soldiers wore them into wars, and poets wore them while writing about both. The French Revolution even gave socks political importance. Citizens wore plain wool as a sign of equality, while nobles clung to their silken hose like emotional support garments. And let's not forget the great unsung hero of exploration, socks in boots. When Napoleon marched into Russia, his soldiers froze not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked dry socks. It's said that more empires have been lost to blisters than bullets. History, it seems, moves one painful step at a time. As centuries passed, socks became poetry in pattern. Argyles, stripes, lace, even political propaganda. By the Victorian era, giving someone socks was a gesture of affection and subtle flirtation. To mend someone's sock was practically an act of love. After all, nothing says eternal devotion like darning someone's holes by candlelight. Today, we barely think about them. They're cheap, mass-produced, and easily mismatched, small sacrifices to the gods of laundry. But their ancient symbolism lingers in tiny ways. We give socks as gifts, as comfort, as tokens of care. They're the first thing we put on in the morning and the last thing we take off before bed. They separate us from the cold floor of the world, and that's no small thing. So next time you open a drawer full of tangled pears, take a moment to appreciate what you're really looking at. 5,000 years of ingenuity, vanity, and frozen toes. From Egyptian tombs to modern dryers, socks have outlasted empires, styles, and common sense. They are, in their quiet way, the perfect symbol of humanity. Ordinary, overlooked, but absolutely essential. Because without them, civilization would have been nothing but cold feet and unfinished journeys. If time is money today, in the ancient world it was divine property, a mysterious thing that flowed at the whim of gods, seasons, and hangovers. Before humans tried to measure time, they lived inside it. Days were ruled by the sun, nights by the stars, and schedules by livestock. The rooster was your alarm clock, the sunset your curfew, and be there at noon meant whenever the shadow looks right. It was an imprecise, blissful chaos, until someone, somewhere, decided that praying should be punctual, that someone was a monk. Monks ruin everything. Long before wristwatches, monasteries ran on prayer schedules, 7 times a day, without fail. The problem was, no one could agree when matins actually began. So the monks built water clocks, slow-dripping contraptions that measured time with leaks. They were unreliable, temperamental, and perfect metaphors for human life. One drop too fast, and you missed Vespers. One drop too slow, and God got impatient. Then came the sundial, time's first social network. Sundials were everywhere, on temples, town squares, and smug people's lawns. They told you the time only when the weather was good, which in Northern Europe meant rarely. Still, they marked a great leap forward. The day was now divisible, and therefore so was human patience. The ancient Greeks refined it, the Romans standardized it, and the medieval world inherited it, along with the headaches of trying to track time in winter darkness. Enter the mechanical mind. Sometime around the 13th century, anonymous inventors in Europe combined 2 dangerous substances, faith and curiosity, and made the first mechanical clocks. They didn't have hands or faces, just gears and bells. Their purpose wasn't to tell you the hour, but to remind you that it existed. The earliest were mounted in church towers, because of course they were. Every clang was a sermon. Tick-tock, memento mori. Remember death, and also, it's time for confession. Peasants in nearby fields looked up, startled, wondering if the noise meant plague or lunchtime. These early clocks were powered by weights and governed by a device called the verge escapement, a small metal arm that rocked back and forth, letting the gears advance 1 tooth at a time. It was elegant, hypnotic, and about as accurate as guessing, but people didn't mind. The point wasn't precision, it was control. For the first time, humanity could command the invisible, divide eternity into manageable chimes. Monasteries embraced it first. Towns followed, installing grand public clocks on cathedrals. The one in Salisbury struck hours that echoed across meadows. The one in Prague added astronomical dials, zodiac symbols, and enough unnecessary decoration to make God jealous. The message was clear. Whoever owned the clock owned the day. And so, time became political. Kings used clocks to coordinate armies. Merchants used them to measure profits. The church used them to remind everyone that only heaven was eternal. In a world where most people couldn't read, a bell became the universal language, a ringing, relentless reminder that your time wasn't really yours, but progress never sleeps unless it's waiting for daylight savings. By the 15th century, clockmakers began miniaturizing their miracles. Portable clocks appeared, enormous, spring-driven lumps of brass that noblemen wore around their necks like nervous pendulums. They were heavy, loud, and hopelessly inaccurate, but they said one thing loudly: I can afford to be late. In the Renaissance, timekeeping became art. Italian craftsmen engraved their clocks with cherubs and Latin mottos like Tempus Fugit, time flies, which is Latin for stop wasting it. The balance spring arrived in the 17th century, giving us the pocket watch, a marvel of precision and status. Gentlemen carried them like portable bragging rights. Women wore smaller ones on delicate chains, ticking softly beneath lace. Soon the world was ticking in unison. Factories, ships, and cities synchronized their bells. The Industrial Revolution turned time from a curiosity into a currency. Punch cards replaced prayers. Schedules replaced seasons. Humanity, once guided by sunlight, was now ruled by second hands. There were rebels, of course, poets, wanderers, and philosophers who despised the tyranny of clocks. They wrote wistful essays about living by the heart's rhythm, and then missed every appointment they ever made. But even they couldn't escape the sound of progress, echoing from every tower and mantle. Tick-tock, tick-tock, the heartbeat of civilization. And yet, for all our precision, time still feels slippery. Clocks only pretend to measure it. They really just remind us it's leaving. Each click is a tiny farewell, every chime a confession. You're mortal, and the bell is on your side of eternity now. Maybe that's why even digital clocks mimic the old rhythm. Somewhere deep in the circuitry, the gears are still turning. A whisper of monks, bells, and water drops echoing through history. Every glowing number on your phone is just a modern prayer. Please, let there be enough time left. So next time you glance at the clock and sigh, remember who built it and why. It wasn't just to count the hours, it was to give them meaning, because once upon a time, time belonged to the gods. And then one day, we built a box, filled it with gears, and told eternity to wait its turn. Long before emails, envelopes, and the eternal anxiety of the seen notification, humans invented something much slower and far more durable: writing. But the first letters weren't written on paper. They were carved, baked, and delivered with the speed of geological erosion. Our story begins in ancient Mesopotamia, around 3200 BCE, a place of temples, traders, and accountants with trust issues. Merchants there faced a dilemma. When you owe someone 20 goats, how do you prove it later without actually bringing the goats? The answer, of course, was clay. They started with small tokens, tiny lumps shaped like sheep, jars, or bread loaves. These were kept inside clay envelopes called bulle. When a deal was done, you'd seal it, stamp it with your personal mark, and hand it over. It was the earliest form of sending a message, and probably the first time anyone complained about bureaucracy. Eventually, someone decided it would be easier to just press symbols into the clay instead of lugging around a zoo's worth of figurines. That brilliant shortcut gave birth to cuneiform, wedge-shaped impressions made with a reed stylus. Each tablet was a small miracle, part ledger, part diary, part complaint to the gods. The first known word ever written wasn't love or peace, it was receipt. Humanity's priorities were established early. Those clay letters were meant to last, and they did. Thousands have survived. Bills, poems, royal decrees, breakup notes written by people who'd never heard of paper cuts. Some were so personal they still read like overheard conversations. To my brother, may the gods keep you well. Also send beer. It's strangely comforting to know people haven't changed much in 5,000 years. As writing spread to Egypt, ink and papyrus arrived, an elegant innovation that finally allowed people to complain in cursive. The Egyptians wrote everything: shopping lists, love letters, curses, even laundry marks for the afterlife. Their postal service, managed by scribes, could deliver messages across hundreds of kilometers using couriers on foot or boat. The motto was clear: neither sandstorm nor crocodile shall stay these messengers. Meanwhile, the Persians turned communication into an empire-wide obsession. King Darius III built the Royal Road, a 2,700-kilometer highway lined with relay stations. Riders changed horses every 25 miles, carrying messages on parchment cylinders stamped with the royal seal. They were so fast that Herodotus marveled. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night prevents them from completing their appointed course. If that sounds familiar, it's because the US Postal Service stole it 2,500 years later, proving that plagiarism is also an ancient art. The Greeks wrote on wax tablets with metal styluses, so they could smooth them over and reuse them. Essentially the world's first delete button. Philosophers used them for notes, merchants for deals, and teenagers for gossip. Somewhere in Athens, a young scribe probably etched Socrates' Sous, and then wiped the evidence before class. The Romans industrialized correspondence. They created tabellari, professional letter carriers who trotted across the empire with scrolls sealed in wax. Wealthy citizens hired secretaries to handle their mail, while poorer folks just yelled from window to window. Letters became lifelines. Soldiers sent them home from the front. Politicians used them for propaganda. Lovers used them for scandal. Cicero's letters alone could fill a library, and occasionally did, because he published his own mail. The ancient equivalent of leaking your DMs for attention. After Rome fell, communication slowed to a crawl. Messengers became monks, letters became prayers, and the art of correspondence was reduced to illuminated manuscripts, copied one agonizing stroke at a time. The Middle Ages turned writing into a form of devotion. Each letter, a tiny act of faith. Each page, a lifetime's patience. A single book might take years to finish, and still someone would spill wine on it. Then came parchment, paper, and the rediscovery of efficiency. By the 12th century, merchants were writing contracts across continents, and kings were sending love letters wrapped in wax and secrecy. Every missive carried the texture of its sender, the slant of their hand, the smell of their room, the wax seal pressed with a ring or thumbprint. A letter wasn't just a message, it was a fingerprint of the soul. In the 15th century, Gutenberg's printing press turned ink into revolution. But even as printed pamphlets spread ideas at record speed, handwritten letters held their magic. Lovers still waited weeks for replies. Generals still sealed orders with trembling hands. Philosophers still argued about postage. And then, centuries later, we replaced wax with send buttons and patience with panic. The average email today travels farther, faster, and with less meaning than a Babylonian clay tablet carried by a sweating scribe through the desert. We can reach anyone, anywhere, instantly, and yet somehow still forget to reply. Maybe that's why those old letters still move us. Because carved or inked, baked or folded, they weren't disposable. They were deliberate. Every mark cost effort, time, and a small part of the sender's life. So the next time your inbox feels overwhelming, imagine holding a warm clay tablet freshly stamped with your name, 5 millennia old and still waiting to be read. Because somewhere in the dust of history, a scribe once pressed a reed into wet clay and invented the first miracle of distance. The power to speak to someone who wasn't there, and to be remembered by the words you left behind. If you were born after the light switch, you probably think of candles as ambience, a birthday decoration, a dinner accessory, a backup plan for when the power company forgets you exist. But for most of human history, candles weren't optional. They were civilization's portable suns, tiny flickering miracles that kept the darkness politely at bay. The first ones weren't fancy. They were lumps of fat, reeds dipped in animal grease, bits of string soaked in tallow. The smell, by all accounts, was appalling, something between wet wool and regret. But when night fell and wolves began composing dinner invitations, any light was sacred. The Egyptians made the earliest versions around 3000 BCE. They didn't call them candles, though. They called them torches, and they were about as safe as you'd expect. The Romans refined the idea, rolling papyrus into tight wicks and dipping them in tallow or beeswax. A wealthy Roman home might glow with hundreds of these little lights, each one sputtering in heroic defiance of soot and gravity. They even had candle clocks, where the burning rate marked the hours. If your candle burned faster, congratulations. Time moved quicker in your house. By the Middle Ages, candles were no longer luxuries, they were necessities. Every church, castle and cottage lived by their flame. The church, always quick to claim good ideas, gave them souls. A candle wasn't just fire, it was prayer made visible. To light one for the dead was to guide them through purgatory. To light one for the living was to remind them they weren't alone. Medieval chandlers, the candle makers, were half craftsmen, half alchemists. Their workshops smelled of beeswax, honey, and ambition. Beeswax was prized above all else. Clean, bright, and pleasantly fragrant, it burned with a steady flame that didn't smoke like tallow. But beeswax came from monasteries and royal estates, which meant it was blessed, expensive, and definitely not for peasants. Ordinary folks used tallow, rendered animal fat, poured into molds or hand-dipped over and over until the candle grew thick and lumpy. A good tallow candle could last several hours. A bad one could summon Satan with the smell alone. Peasants learned to ration them carefully. Families often had just one candle, carried room to room like a holy relic, passed from hand to hand with whispered negotiations about bedtime. The act of lighting a candle was ritual in itself. You didn't just strike a flame, you invoked safety. The spark from flint to wick was both chemistry and theology. Children were warned never to blow out a candle too quickly, lest they offend the angel guarding the flame. Some believed each flicker meant a spirit passing by. Others said a candle that wouldn't stay lit was rejecting sin. In monasteries, entire nights were measured by candlelight. The monks' tall tapers burned, through vigils and prayers, casting long shadows that made the stone walls breathe. They wrote hymns comparing wax to purity and flame to divine love. Yet even in holy hands, candles were unpredictable, dripping wax like tears, hissing when too much salt lingered in the tallow. A monk once wrote that a misbehaving candle was a test sent by the Lord to measure patience. By the Renaissance, chandlers had turned candle making into high art. Parisian guilds guarded their recipes like royal secrets. They experimented with wicks of twisted cotton, new molds, even perfume. The wealthy ordered scented candles shaped like flowers, fruits, or mythical beasts, because nothing says humility before God, like a candle shaped like a swan. Meanwhile, science quietly crept in. In the 18th century, chemists discovered spermaceti, a wax derived from sperm whales, and revolutionized candlelight. These candles burned cleanly, evenly, and smelled faintly of oceanic doom. Entire whaling industries sprang up to keep parlours glowing, each flicker powered by maritime tragedy. For a while, the world's finest light came from the heads of dead whales. Humanity, as usual, was complicated. Then came the 19th century, the age of gas lamps, oil lamps, and eventually electricity. Candles began to fade, demoted from necessity to nostalgia. But people refused to give them up. Churches kept them, poets adored them, lovers relied on them. The candle survived by reinventing itself as a symbol of warmth, faith, romance, and sometimes mild fire hazards. Even today, every flickering wick carries that ancient paradox, fragile but enduring, temporary but timeless. A candle burns itself away to give light, an act of sacrifice that philosophers, monks, and mothers have all admired for centuries. It's hard not to feel reverence watching a flame consume its own body, one tiny breath at a time. And let's not forget the science of dripping, that hypnotic, molten descent of wax pooling around the base, sculpting miniature landscapes as the flame devours time. Newton once studied candlelight to understand optics. Faraday used it to explain combustion. Poets used it to explain heartbreak. Everyone found a reflection of themselves in its quiet persistence. So tonight, if you light a candle, maybe for dinner, maybe for someone you miss, pause for a moment. You're joining an unbroken ritual older than history. The Egyptians would recognize it. So would the monks. So would the sailors whose whales powered Victorian chandeliers. The flame that lives in your room tonight has burned in one form or another for 5,000 years. Through temples and tombs, through cathedrals and kitchens, through grief and celebration alike. It is light that remembers darkness, and it still burns for the same reason it always did. Because night, no matter how ancient, always needs a little help finding its end. Before money jingled in pockets, it clinked in. Temples. Before it bought groceries, it bribed gods. You see, currency began not as a convenience, but as a prayer. The first coins weren't about trade. They were about trust, and the first wallets didn't hold cash. They held superstition. Let's start in the ancient kingdom of Lydia, around 600 BCE, present-day Turkey, back when the world still smelled faintly of olive oil and ambition. A clever monarch named King Alyattes decided that bartering goats for grain was taking too long. His people needed a universal promise, a piece of metal that said, "This is worth something because we all agree to pretend it is." He minted small bean-shaped lumps of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, stamped with lions and gods. They were the first true coins, and they were revolutionary. Suddenly, value could travel. You could hold trust in your hand. The idea spread like wildfire through the ancient world. The Greeks embraced it, turning coins into pocket-sized art galleries. They stamped Athena's owl, Zeus's thunderbolt, Apollo's smirk. Each coin carried its city's pride, its faith, and a faint smell of someone's sweaty palm. To the Greeks, money was divine. Temples had their own treasuries, priests their own accounting systems. A coin could buy bread, but it could also buy forgiveness. When in doubt, make an offering. The gods, apparently, had excellent exchange rates. The Romans, as usual, took a good idea and industrialized it. Their mint in Rome churned out thousands of coins daily, each bearing the emperor's face. This wasn't just currency, It was propaganda. Every transaction became a tiny act of worship to Caesar. Pay your taxes, and you'd literally rub his nose in it. But Romans were also deeply superstitious about money. They buried coins with the dead to pay Charon, the ferryman of the underworld. The logic was simple. Even in death, you needed change for the boat ride. Archaeologists have found countless skulls with small coins pressed between their teeth. The world's oldest fare included package. As for wallets, those came later, and they were more pouch than portfolio. Early Greeks tied their coins in cloth bags called balanchons, which they tucked into robes or hid in sandals. Romans used small leather purses called marsupia, yes, like the kangaroo pouch. These were often tied around the waist, the ancient equivalent of a fanny pack, minus the irony. Money, of course, carried curses as easily as it carried wealth. People believed coins could absorb the energy of their owners, fortune or misfortune alike. Steal one, and you didn't just get the metal, you got the baggage. Witches were said to bewitch coins with spells of greed or sickness. Some even melted cursed coins into amulets to repel thieves, which only proves how confused ancient economics could get. In medieval Europe, coins became holier and heavier. Kings stamped crosses on them to sanctify commerce. "God on my right," read one English inscription, as if heaven personally endorsed inflation. Still, people distrusted money. Usury was sinful, profit was suspicious, and yet everyone needed both. The church condemned greed in sermons, then counted its tithes in the back room. Ordinary people handled coins with care. They tested silver by biting it, a habit that survived mostly because it looked dramatic. They whispered blessings before spending their last penny. A coin tossed into a well became a wish, an ancient superstition that still survives in mall fountains today. The Romans threw coins into springs to honor water spirits. Now we do it to honor Instagram. By the Renaissance, the world was spinning on commerce. Merchants carried satchels of clinking metal. Bankers invented promissory notes, and pickpockets invented early retirement. Leather wallets evolved to hold folded paper money. An innovation so shocking that many refused to trust it. How can paper be worth gold? They asked. Answer: because someone rich said so. Even then, people kept talismans in their purses. Tiny saints, locks of hair, bits of bone. The line between faith and finance blurred completely. To open your wallet was to open your soul. Here was your livelihood, your protection, your future. You didn't just carry money, you carried the idea of security. As trade routes expanded, coins became storytellers. Venetian ducats, Spanish doubloons, Arabic dinars. Each one a symbol of a world getting smaller and greedier. Pirates wore them as jewelry, monks hoarded them for repairs, and peasants buried them under floorboards for the next life, which often came sooner than planned. Eventually, coins shrank, purses flattened, and the first pocket wallet appeared in the 17th century. A slim leather folder to hold notes, receipts, and perhaps a portrait of someone worth waiting for. It wasn't about survival anymore. It was about identity. And then came paper bills, plastic cards, and digital currencies. Coins turned to code, wallets to Wi-Fi. We now carry invisible empires in our pockets, trusting unseen networks the way ancients once trusted gods. The faith is the same, only the altars have changed. But every now and then, when you find an old coin in a drawer or on a cobbled street, you can still feel its history. The worn edge, the faded face, a tiny echo of all the hands that held it, all the hopes it carried, all the markets and misfortunes it witnessed. Hold it up to the light, and you might see what our ancestors saw. Not money, not metal, but a promise. A human invention so audacious it borders on magic, that a small circle of earth could stand in for trust. So spend it wisely, because the world still runs on the oldest spell of all, the belief that value, once imagined together, becomes real. It's easy to forget that mirrors are portals, not the magical kind that transport you to alternate worlds, though for a moment in history, people absolutely believed they could. But the quiet kind that reflects something most of us spend a lifetime avoiding: ourselves. Before mirrors were commonplace, seeing your own face was a rare event. You caught glimpses of yourself in still water, in polished metal, maybe in a friend's flattery. You knew what you looked like only through rumor. Then came the mirror, and with it, the unsettling experience of meeting your own eyes. The earliest mirrors were obsidian, sheets of volcanic glass polished until they gleamed like black water. The ancient Sumerians used them 6,000 years ago, followed by the Egyptians, who made smaller ones from bronze. They were heavy, cloudy, and distorted, more philosophical than accurate. When you looked into one, you didn't see you exactly. You saw an idea of you shimmering through oxidation and candle smoke. For the Egyptians, mirrors were sacred. They symbolized the sun's power to reflect life. Priests polished them daily, believing the surface could catch divine light, or worse, trap a soul. Many mirrors were buried in tombs to help the dead recognize themselves in the afterlife. Others were inscribed with prayers to ward off evil, because nobody wanted to wake up in eternity looking disheveled. The Greeks and Romans loved mirrors too, but they saw danger in them. The philosopher Socrates warned that too much reflection led to vanity. Meanwhile, oracles claimed polished metal could reveal the future. Fortune tellers gazed into bowls of water or bronze to divine omens. The world's earliest mirror scrying. It was less Snow White's magic mirror and more Wi-Fi connection to the divine, but extremely unstable. Then came the Middle Ages, a time when the church grew suspicious of anything that encouraged self-awareness. Mirrors, they said, tempted pride. To stare at your own face was to flirt with sin. Monks smashed them, preachers condemned them, and sermons warned that demons could crawl through the glass. Reflection became a moral hazard, and yet mirrors persisted. Medieval artisans couldn't resist their beauty. They crafted small discs of polished steel and silver, often backed with holy symbols to keep the devil out. Nobles carried hand mirrors as luxuries, proof that you had both vanity and money to spare. A lady might check her veil before prayer, justifying it as spiritual preparation. Everyone knew it was fashion. Then, in the 13th century, Venetian glassmakers changed everything. On the island of Murano, artisans discovered that coating glass with a thin layer of metal, first tin, later silver, produced a perfect reflection. The result was astonishing. Clear, bright, and unsettlingly honest. For the first time in history, people could see themselves as others saw them. Humanity collectively went, "Oh no." Mirrors became objects of fascination and fear. They were so valuable that nobles kept them locked away. Some were rumored to drive people mad, others to reveal angels or ghosts. It's no coincidence that the same era produced both Renaissance self-portraits and witch trials. Once you can see yourself clearly, you begin to question what's looking back. The church eventually relented, deciding that reflection could serve piety if used in moderation. Artists embraced it. Painters used mirrors to study anatomy, perspective, and vanity. Alchemists used them to focus light in experiments. Magicians used them to fake miracles. Mirrors became tools of both enlightenment and deception, literal windows into the duality of human nature. Superstition, of course, clung to them. Breaking a mirror was said to bring 7 years of bad luck, not because of shards or safety hazards, but because people believed mirrors held a piece of the soul. To shatter one was to injure yourself spiritually. Covering mirrors after a death became tradition, so the departing soul wouldn't get trapped in reflection. And if you ever felt chills staring into one by candlelight, well, congratulations. You've just recreated a 16th century divination ritual banned by 3 separate popes. By the Victorian era, mirrors were everywhere. Mass-produced, decorative, and slightly vain. They hung in parlours, reflected gaslight, and multiplied chandeliers into infinity. The mirror had gone from mystical relic to household companion. Yet even then, it retained its quiet unease. The mirror, wrote one 19th century poet, is where the soul learns its posture, which is a beautiful way of saying, don't look too long. Psychologists later coined the mirror stage, that moment when infants recognize themselves for the first time. The reaction is universal. Awe, confusion, laughter. Somewhere in that realization lies the root of identity. The moment we understand we exist as both subject and object. In other words, mirrors didn't just change how we looked, they changed how we thought. And now, in the age of smartphones and front-facing cameras, we live surrounded by mirrors. We curate our reflections, edit them, filter them, monetize them. The superstition has changed, but the power hasn't. Every selfie is a spell, an attempt to control how the world sees us, and maybe how we see ourselves. So next time you catch your reflection in a window or a screen, remember what you're really looking at. 6,000 years of human self-awareness condensed into one flicker of light. A chain of obsidian, bronze, silver, and pixels. Each surface repeating the same eternal question. Who are you really? And if you stare too long and the reflection blinks back, don't panic. It's probably just history, finally making eye contact. If you've ever been told to cut down on salt, congratulations. You've officially achieved what emperors, popes, and pirates once fought entire wars over. Because for most of human history, salt wasn't just a seasoning, it was life itself. Long before it sat quietly in shakers, salt was a cosmic substance, a preservative, a purifier, a miracle mineral that kept food, flesh, and even faith from spoiling. Civilizations didn't just crave it, they revolved around it. Let's rewind about 10,000 years. Early humans had a problem. Meat rots, vegetables wilt, and refrigeration hadn't been invented yet. But salt, glorious crystalline salt, could stop decay in its tracks. Sprinkle it on fish or meat, and you could eat weeks later without dying. Sprinkle it on wounds, and you could at least pretend you were doing medicine. Sprinkle it into holy water, and suddenly it was divine. The Egyptians used salt to embalm the dead, preserving kings like glorified jerky for the afterlife. They mined it from dry desert lakes, hauling it across dunes by camel. It was sacred enough to be offered to the gods and practical enough to flavor your lentils. Even the word salary traces its roots to salarium, a payment once given to Roman soldiers for, quite literally, buying salt. You weren't worth your salt unless you'd earned it. Salt built empires and broke them. In ancient China, rulers realized early that whoever controlled salt controlled everything. They taxed it ruthlessly, turning brine into gold. The Chinese salt monopoly financed armies, wars, and dynasties. A similar story unfolded in Africa. Caravans crossed the Sahara, carrying blocks of salt so precious they were traded ounce for ounce with gold. Imagine traveling 1,000 miles on camelback to deliver someone's future French fries. The Bible loved salt too. Lot's wife famously turned into it, an early cautionary tale about disobedience and dehydration. Jesus called his followers the salt of the earth, which in context was high praise, meaning pure, essential, incorruptible. In short, don't be bland. Meanwhile, the Greeks and Romans made salt a moral issue. Take salt with someone, they said, and it meant sharing trust, a bond of hospitality that even the gods respected. Breaking that bond was unforgivable. Salt sealed contracts, friendships, and dinners. To this day, the word salad owes its existence to the Roman habit of salting greens. Civilization's first Caesar salad, minus the dressing. But salt's power had a darker side. In the Middle Ages, salt became currency. Towns rose around its sources. Salzburg literally means salt fortress. Whoever held the mines held the market, and everyone else paid dearly. Peasants spent days boiling seawater or scraping salt flats under the sun, laboring for crumbs of crystalline wealth. Kings hoarded it, merchants smuggled it, and smugglers died for it. France's notorious gabelle, a salt tax introduced in the 14th century, became one of the most hated laws in history. The poor paid triple what the rich did, and failure to comply could land you in prison. By the time of the French Revolution, "Down with the Salt Tax" was practically a national anthem. It's not a coincidence that one of the first things the revolutionaries abolished was that very tax: liberty, equality, and reasonably priced seasoning. Even Gandhi waged war with it. In 1930, he marched 240 miles to the sea to protest Britain's salt monopoly in India. Thousands joined him, gathering salt from the shore in defiance of colonial law. It wasn't about spice, it was about sovereignty. Every grain he lifted from the ground was a reminder that freedom, like salt, begins in the earth and ends in your hands. Salt's influence stretched beyond economics and rebellion. It shaped language, superstition, and ritual. Spilling it was bad luck, probably because it was expensive. The solution? Toss a pinch over your left shoulder to blind the devil. Sharing it sealed friendship. Wasting it tempted fate. Even today, salty means irritated, a linguistic echo of ancient worth. Science eventually demystified it. Sodium and chloride, simple ions, essential for nerves, blood, and taste. But the chemistry never quite erased the mythology. Salt remained symbolic of endurance and purity. Monks blessed it, sailors swore by it, and mothers sprinkled it in cradles to ward off evil spirits. In the kitchen, salt became democratic. Once a sign of wealth, it became the most common flavor on earth, equally at home in royal banquets and roadside diners. It draws out sweetness, deepens flavor, and turns blandness into memory. To season food is to participate in an ancient universal ritual, an invisible thread connecting every meal back to the first campfire. And yet, even in its simplicity, salt retains its quiet grandeur. Every grain is a fossilized piece of ocean. Sunlight, wind, and time crystallized into something you can hold between your fingers. Each flake, a tiny echo of the planet's memory. So next time you season your fries, remember, you're performing the same act that built roads, funded empires, and sparked revolutions. You're holding in your hand the mineral that taught humanity to preserve, not just food, but itself. And maybe that's why salt never really loses its power. It's the taste of survival, the flavor of civilization. And like all the best things in history, it's worth just a little pinch of awe. If history had a sound, it might be the soft, steady whisper of thread sliding through fabric. because long before the hum of machines or the ring of coin, there was the quiet rhythm of sewing, humanity's most intimate technology. The needle is one of the oldest tools we've ever made, and arguably one of the most transformative. Without it, there are no clothes, no sails, no tents, no civilization cozy enough to survive its own ambitions. Every empire was stitched together, quite literally, by someone who knew how to sew. The first needles weren't metal, they were bone, carved from the ribs of reindeer or mammoth, polished smooth and sharpened to a lethal elegance. Archaeologists have found some over 40,000 years old, each with a tiny, perfect eye drilled through the end. Imagine the patience. Imagine the lighting. One slip, and your Paleolithic fashion show was postponed indefinitely. Those early seamstresses and tailors, most of them women, though the occasional determined caveman joined in, weren't sewing for style. They were sewing for survival. A needle was as vital as a spear. The difference between shivering and sleeping, between frostbite and fashion. Animal hides became tunics, sinews became thread, and somewhere between survival and creativity, the first stitch of culture was made. By the time of ancient Egypt, sewing had become artistry. Tomb paintings show linen robes so fine they were almost transparent, sewn with needles of copper and bronze. Thread came from flax, spun, twisted, and dyed under the same desert sun that had seen humanity's first stitches. Pharaohs were buried with needles among their treasures because even eternity might require a quick hem. In Greece and Rome, sewing divided classes. Slaves and servants mended clothes. Aristocrats merely commissioned them. Still, the act itself held quiet respect. A Roman poet once wrote that the hand that mends is the hand that rules, which might have been metaphorical, or just a fancy way to say, don't mess with the tailor. The Middle Ages elevated sewing to both duty and devotion. Monks copied manuscripts, nuns stitched altar cloths, and queens embroidered tapestries chronicling their husbands' questionable decisions. Every stitch told a story. The Bayeux tapestry, for example, wasn't just decoration. It was propaganda in thread, 70 meters of medieval storytelling that outlasted its kings. And then there were the superstitions. Needles were magic after all. Sharp, precise, and easily lost. Drop one, and it meant a visitor was coming. Snap one, and you'd broken a bond. In many cultures, sewing after dark was forbidden. You might accidentally stitch your fate into the fabric. A needle could bind or bless, curse or cure. It was both tool and talisman. In Japan, they even held funerals for broken needles, harikuyo, the festival of needles. Women would gather at temples and lay their worn, bent needles to rest in blocks of tofu, soft beds for the sharp instruments that had served them faithfully all year. It wasn't just ritual, it was gratitude in its purest form. By the Renaissance, sewing became status. Embroidery blossomed into opulence, gold thread on silk, pearls sewn into gowns, saints stitched in technicolor. A single garment could take months, even years. Needles grew finer, thread grew stronger. A good seamstress could sew an invisible line, so perfect it looked woven by the gods. Then came the Industrial Revolution, and with it, the machine that changed everything. In the 1840s, inventors from America to France raced to mechanize the needle. Elias Howe and Isaac Singer eventually perfected the sewing machine, a marvel of gears, levers, and moving steel that could outstitch a dozen hands in minutes. Tailors protested, housewives swooned, factories roared, and just like that, the needle had multiplied its power 1,000-fold. But for all its mechanical precision, the soul of sewing never disappeared. Soldiers carried sewing kits, housewives, they called them, to mend uniforms in muddy trenches. Immigrants sewed flags and dresses that carried pieces of home. Sailors stitched sails against the wind. Mothers mended clothes against time. The humble needle became a quiet rebellion against waste, against loss, against the unraveling of everything. Even today, the language of sewing shapes our thoughts. We speak of threads of fate, cutting ties, and being on pins and needles. We patch things up when life tears, weave stories when words connect, and come apart at the seams when we can't hold it together. The metaphor was never an accident. It's the echo of our oldest human habit: to fix, to bind, to create meaning with our hands. So the next time you see a needle, in a drawer, a kit, or between your fingers, pause for a moment. It's not just a sliver of steel. It's a key to human persistence. A tool that stitched warmth into cold, dignity into rags, hope into every patch. Because every civilization, no matter how vast or advanced, depends on someone who knows how to keep things from falling apart. And somewhere, even now, under a lamp's soft glow, a quiet hand still threads the world back together. If you lived in ancient times and drank only water, well, congratulations, you didn't live long. For thousands of years, humans looked at rivers, wells, and puddles, the main sources of drinking water, and decided to add alcohol to the mix. Not because they wanted to party, but because they wanted to survive. The irony is delicious. Civilization owes its life to mild intoxication. Water was unreliable. Every village had that one suspicious stream that sparkled beautifully by day and poisoned half the town by night. People didn't understand bacteria yet, but they knew this. When you mixed water with wine or beer, you didn't die. And since humans love not dying, the habit stuck. The first great alcoholic accident probably happened somewhere in the Fertile Crescent, around 7000 BCE. A jar of grapes was left forgotten in the sun, and nature, ever the improviser, invented wine. The ancient drinker who first took a sip likely thought, "This tastes strange, but I feel great." Civilization was about to get creative. The Egyptians treated wine like medicine and religion rolled into one. They buried amphorae of it with their pharaohs so they could stay hydrated in the afterlife. Responsibly, of course. Meanwhile, the Greeks made wine the centerpiece of philosophy. Socrates drank it while asking impossible questions. Dionysus, the god of wine, embodied both joy and chaos, because moderation wasn't really the point. The Romans industrialized it. They had vineyards stretching from Spain to Syria, and even a word for overconsumption, bacchanalia. They watered down their wine for daily drinking, reserving the pure stuff for special occasions, like surviving the plague or running out of spoons. Children drank diluted wine, soldiers drank it, poets romanticized it, and nobody questioned why hangovers felt like divine punishment. Beer had an equally noble origin. In ancient Sumeria, around 4000 BCE, women, yes women, were the brewers. They turned barley into a thick, porridge-like drink that was safer than water, and came with a mild buzz. Workers were even paid in beer rations. You could literally drink your salary, which made payday particularly interesting. When civilization spread, so did fermentation. The Chinese mastered rice wine, the Celts made mead, the Africans brewed sorghum beer, and the Incas fermented maize. Everywhere people lived, they found something that could rot politely, and turned it into a beverage. The genius of fermentation wasn't just chemistry, it was hygiene by accident. The alcohol killed the dangerous stuff before it could kill you. In the Middle Ages, monasteries became brewing powerhouses. Monks, those tireless multitaskers of salvation, perfected the art of making beer and wine for religious purposes. They may have called it liquid bread, but make no mistake, it was the holiest loophole in history. If salvation came in a cup, it was probably foamy. Clean drinking water remained a fantasy. Wells were polluted, rivers ran foul, and plumbing, when it existed, was an adventure in denial. Even children drank small beer, a weak brew with just enough alcohol to sterilize it. You couldn't get drunk on it unless you really tried, and many did. When explorers set sail across the oceans, they brought barrels of beer and wine, not water. Fresh water spoiled, grew algae, and turned into soup. But alcohol kept. Columbus's ships carried more wine than tools. Pirates drank grog, a mixture of rum, sugar, and despair, because it was safer than seawater. Naval discipline was often measured by how drunk the crew wasn't. Then came distillation, the science of concentrating the fun. By the Renaissance, chemists discovered how to turn wine into spirits, and suddenly the world became a little blurrier and much more bearable. Doctors prescribed brandy for everything from coughs to heartbreak. Soldiers used it to numb pain. Poets used it to find inspiration, and politicians used it to explain bad decisions. But beneath the laughter and the hangovers, the truth remained. Alcohol kept humanity alive. It wasn't a luxury, it was public health. Before sanitation, before plumbing, before germ theory, fermentation was the only consistency method of purification we had. Every sip of wine, beer, or cider was an unconscious act of survival. It wasn't until the 19th century that we realized why. Louis Pasteur, while studying wine spoilage, discovered microorganisms, the invisible culprits behind rot and disease. In trying to make better booze, he invented microbiology. Civilization's great sterilizer had become its great teacher. By then, clean water was finally becoming accessible. Filtration, plumbing, and chlorination made it safe to drink from the tap. But even as science freed us from necessity, habit held on. Wine and beer had long since become symbols of culture, ritual, and connection. They were no longer survival tools. They were social ones. And so, we still raise glasses to toast the same things our ancestors did. Love, luck, peace, and the fact that we're not dead yet. Every sip carries echoes of that ancient revelation. That something could rot beautifully, that decay could save life, that pleasure could be medicine. The next time you clink glasses with friends, remember, you're participating in humanity's oldest public health policy, one that began by accident, saved countless lives, and ended with karaoke. Because once upon a time, to drink was to cheat death. And humans, it turns out, have always been very good at that. If cleanliness is next to godliness, humanity took an awfully long time getting close, because for most of history, being clean was either suspicious, expensive, or both. And the story of how we went from mud-caked pilgrims to bubble bath enthusiasts is a tale of chemistry, superstition, and a whole lot of questionable hygiene. Soap, at its core, is simple. Fat meets ashes, they fall in love, and together they remove dirt. But the first people to discover that probably didn't do it on purpose. Somewhere around 2800 BCE, near the banks of the Tigris or the Nile, a cook or priest, or perhaps a clumsy alchemist, noticed that rainwater mixed with animal fat and wood ash left behind a slippery residue, one that actually cleaned things. It was the original happy accident, the world's first chemical romance. The Babylonians made early soap from rendered fat and lye, though they used it less for washing people and more for scrubbing wool and textiles. Clean fabric was holy. Clean humans, that was negotiable. Egyptians, ever practical, used aromatic oils and soda ash instead, turning bathing into both hygiene and performance art. They oiled, scraped, and perfumed their bodies daily, a kind of desert spa ritual. Then looked across the Mediterranean and wondered why everyone else smelled like regret. The Romans, of course, turned bathing into an Olympic event. Their thermae were vast public complexes where citizens could soak, gossip, and negotiate business deals naked without breaking eye contact. Soap wasn't always part of the ritual. Instead, they slathered themselves in oil and scraped it off with bronze blades, called strigils. The result was gleaming skin, a low infection rate, and an unholy amount of body oil recycling. Then came the Middle Ages, history's longest personal hygiene experiment. When Rome fell, so did the plumbing. Cleanliness became less a civic virtue and more a moral hazard. Bathhouses still existed, but they gained reputations. By the 13th century, they were less spa day and more social networking with consequences. The Church, in its infinite prudence, decided that bathing led to lust, and lust led to sin, and therefore soap was suspicious by association. Medieval people didn't never bathe. They just did it less. Way less. Maybe once a season, unless something itched. Instead, they relied on linen shirts to absorb sweat, herbs to mask odor, and denial to get through winter. Royalty fared no better. Queen Isabella of Castile reportedly bragged she'd bathed twice in her life, once at birth and once before marriage. This is not, strictly speaking, a flex, but soap persisted in corners of the world less impressed by guilt. In the Arab world, chemists refined the recipe into something resembling what we use today, a smooth, solid bar made from olive oil, soda, and lye. Syrian cities like Aleppo became famous for their green, fragrant soaps. Crusaders returning to Europe brought them home, along with new diseases. And suddenly, foreign soap became the height of luxury. Still, most Europeans regarded bathing as an exotic, borderline dangerous habit, like eating sushi in a thunderstorm. It wasn't until the 16th and 17th centuries that soap began to redeem itself. In Spain and Italy, soap making flourished. In France, it became art. The city of Marseille perfected the process with sea salt and olive oil, creating a product so fine it was blessed by royal decree. Meanwhile, England had its own problem: soap taxes. Because of course they did. For centuries, British soap was so heavily taxed that cleanliness became a class marker. The poor smelled poor, and the rich smelled like lavender hypocrisy. Then came the Enlightenment, that magical time when people rediscovered both reason and bathing. Doctors began linking hygiene with health, and the wealthy competed for who could have the cleanest linens. By the 1800s, soap was finally respectable. Industrial chemistry made it affordable, and advertising made it emotional. Victorian companies sold purity in bars, promising soft skin, moral virtue, and fewer diseases, though mostly just the soft skin. And thus was born the Great Hygiene Revolution. Public health campaigns preached the gospel of soap. Schools taught hand washing. Soldiers carried bars in their kits. By World War I, soap was patriotic. "Wash away the enemy," said posters, which was perhaps a stretch, but at least everyone smelled better. Then came the 20th century, and bubbles. Chemists discovered synthetic detergents, marketing teams discovered joy, and suddenly, bathing, became an event. Foam was luxury, scent was identity. Bathing moved from necessity to ritual, from survival to self-care. The same substance that once symbolized sin was now bottled in lavender and sold with whale music. And yet, beneath the froth and fragrance, the story remains the same. Soap has always been about more than cleanliness. It's about transformation, the belief that we can wash away what clings to us, whether it's dirt, disease, or a difficult day. In a way, every bar of soap is a small miracle of chemistry and hope. Fat, ash, and water turned into renewal. It's proof that even the ugliest mixtures can make something pure. So tonight, when you step into a bath, when the water steams and the bubbles rise, remember the thousands of years it took to earn that simple luxury. You're performing an ancient act, one that emperors, monks, and alchemists once argued about, now repackaged with a coconut scent. And when the last bubbles pop and fade away, you'll have recreated the same old miracle. A brief, shining moment of being clean, in a world that never really is. Before history could be written, it had to be wrapped. The earliest record keepers didn't stack their knowledge into neat little pages. They rolled it up like a burrito of bureaucracy. The scroll, that elegant cylinder of ink and optimism, was humanity's first attempt at capturing thought in portable form. And like all great inventions, it began as an accident. Thousands of years ago in Mesopotamia and Egypt, people realized that carving on stone was too heavy for casual reading. You couldn't exactly curl up in bed with a slab of granite. So they turned to something lighter. Papyrus, a plant that grew along the Nile, sliced into strips, pressed flat, and dried into sheets that could be rolled, tied, and unrolled again. Each scroll was a masterpiece of patience. One mistake, one careless scribe sneezing mid-sentence, and the entire roll might be ruined. There was no delete key, no undo, just ink, sweat, and the faint sound of despair echoing through the scriptorium. The Greeks fell in love with scrolls and filled libraries with them. The great library of Alexandria was less a building and more a mountain of rolled-up optimism, where scholars debated philosophy while praying no one tripped over Aristotle's notes. The Romans, ever the pragmatists, standardized the form. Scrolls of parchment stitched together, sometimes stretching 30 feet long. Reading one was a full-body workout. You'd stand there rolling with one hand, unrolling with the other, muttering, "Just one more column and I'll take a break." Then came the problem of finding anything. Need to reread a passage? Good luck. Ancient scholars developed complicated systems of knots, ribbons, and marginal notes, the first bookmarks. Even so, information retrieval remained a nightmare. If you've ever watched someone scroll endlessly through a phone looking for a screenshot, congratulations, you're reenacting the ancient world. The breakthrough came around the 1st century CE, the Codex. Someone, historians still argue, who decided to stack parchment sheets, fold them, and bind one edge. The result looked suspiciously like a modern book. It could be opened flat, indexed, even annotated. It was, in short, the ancient world's version of a software update that actually worked. Christians loved the Codex. It was practical, portable, and, importantly, less pagan-looking than a scroll. Monks copied Gospels into codices by the thousands, each one bound in leather and clasped with metal. To them, the book itself was holy, a physical incarnation of order, a victory over chaos. Still, the transition wasn't smooth. Traditionalists scoffed. Scrolls have served us since Moses. Others worried the Codex would cheapen writing, make it too easy to reproduce heresy. Spoiler, they were right, and we got the printing press. By the Middle Ages, the Codex had conquered. Scriptoria buzzed with quills and candlelight. Every monastery kept at least one monk who specialized in illuminating manuscripts, literally painting the pages with gold leaf and tiny dragons, because apparently reading wasn't stressful enough. Books became symbols of knowledge and power. To own one was to own a piece of eternity. But the book had its own dark side. The more efficiently humans recorded their thoughts, the more thoughts they felt compelled to record. Suddenly, the world filled with ledgers, logs, and lists. Bureaucracy bloomed. A new plague emerged, the to-do list. Once invented, it could never be eradicated. Ancient scribes made them on wax tablets. Medieval merchants kept them in pocket ledgers. Modern humans carry them in apps that beep judgmentally every hour. Civilization, it seems, cannot resist documenting its own overwhelm. The Renaissance turned the Codex into art. Gutenberg's printing press exploded literacy, sending books cascading into the hands of anyone who could afford them, and plenty who couldn't. Knowledge was no longer rolled up and guarded by priests. It was stacked on shelves, dog-eared, underlined, occasionally used to steady wobbly tables. The world began reading itself awake, and with that awakening came obsession. Libraries swelled, scholars categorized, cross-referenced, and footnoted. The scroll, once a symbol of divine mystery, was replaced by the index, humanity's ultimate declaration that everything could be organized, even if it never actually was. Fast forward to today, and we've come full circle. We no longer unroll papyrus, we scroll through screens. The motion is identical, a continuous search for meaning, information, distraction. Each flick of the finger echoes the rhythm of ancient hands turning parchment. The Codex evolved into the tablet, the library into the cloud, and the infinite to-do list. It's now digital, synchronized across devices, and still haunting us. Yet for all our progress, the magic hasn't changed. Whether ink or pixel, page or screen, the act of writing remains the same ancient spell. The belief that words can outlast us, that a thought, once recorded, becomes a bridge between minds separated by centuries. So the next time you jot something down, a reminder, a dream, a grocery list, remember what you're holding. It's not just paper or pixels. It's the latest chapter in a 5,000-year experiment in memory. And if your list never ends, if the tasks multiply like rabbits, take comfort. You're in excellent company. The monks, the merchants, the pharaohs, all of them once sat where you are now, quill in hand, whispering to themselves, just one more thing. If you're sitting down right now, congratulations. You're doing something that, for most of human history, was a royal privilege. We take chairs for granted. We eat in them, work in them, doom scroll in them. But once upon a time, sitting in comfort meant you were either divine, powerful, or very tired and pretending to be both. In the beginning, there were no chairs, only the ground. Early humans squatted, knelt, or perched on rocks. It wasn't laziness, it was democracy. Everyone's posterior met the same earth. Thrones, stools, benches, all of those came later, after someone decided they were too important to share the dirt. Archaeologists have found some of the earliest chairs in ancient Egypt, built around 2600 BCE. They were exquisite, carved wood, gilded legs, cushions stuffed with reeds. Pharaohs sat on them not to rest, but to proclaim, "Look upon my lumbar support and despair." These weren't chairs, they were hieroglyphs of authority. Their backs stood tall, their arms outstretched, their seats elevated, as if to remind everyone that comfort was not a right, but a rank. Meanwhile, peasants sat on the floor, and priests knelt before them. The higher your chair, the closer you were to heaven, or at least to good posture. Even the word chairman comes from this very logic. To hold the chair meant to hold command. To stand was to serve. Across the Mediterranean, the Greeks adopted chairs for their elites. They called the throne of Zeus Klismos, a sleek, curved design that still influences furniture today. Philosophers, however, often preferred benches or bare stone, as if refusing cushions made their ideas sharper. Socrates, it seems, never owned a recliner. The Romans took things further, inventing the curule chair, a folding seat of ivory reserved for magistrates and generals. It was the ancient world's version of a reserved parking space, portable authority. When a Roman sat in that seat, decisions were made, laws were passed, and egos were inflated. Everyone else, benches if you were lucky. But after Rome collapsed, so did the art of sitting comfortably. Medieval Europe brought back the hierarchy of discomfort. Kings and bishops reclined on ornate thrones, often so heavy they had to be carried by servants. The rest of humanity made do with stools or the floor. To sit on a chair in the presence of royalty could be seen as treason. Peasants didn't even try. Centuries of back pain were endured in silence. The church caught on to the symbolism. Bishops sat in elaborate cathedrae, which gave us the word cathedral, literally, the church with a chair. The Pope's throne wasn't just furniture, it was theology in wood. To sit was to judge, to rule, to bless. No wonder medieval saints were always depicted standing. Humility doesn't sit down. By the Renaissance, chairs finally began to trickle down. Wealthy merchants commissioned carved oak seats with embroidered cushions, while scholars filled studies with straight-backed wooden chairs designed to promote both focus and scoliosis. Sitting became a mark of refinement, not just a pause, but a posture of intellect. Painters started depicting thinkers, not kings in chairs. The throne of wisdom had become academic furniture. And then came the domestic revolution. The chair invaded the home. In the 17th and 18th centuries, design exploded. High-backed, low-backed, winged, cushioned, rocking. Each shape had purpose. The armchair emerged for reading and retirement, the dining chair for pretending to have manners. And somewhere along the way, society agreed that chairs should match the table, birthing an entire industry of aesthetic anxiety. Still, chairs never fully lost their social power. In royal courts, courtiers competed for the right to sit. Louis XIV, the Sun King, allowed only a select few nobles the privilege of using folding stools in his presence, a small mercy they bragged about for years. The rest had to stand, perfectly still, while he luxuriated in upholstery. The monarchy's motto might as well have been, "Sit down, not in this lifetime." Then came the 19th century, and industrialization made chairs cheap and plentiful. Factories churned them out by the thousands. For the first time in history, ordinary people could own not just one chair, but several. A revolution in ergonomics and equality. The throne had finally gone public, but the chair's story didn't end with equality. It evolved into irony. In the 20th century, we invented the recliner, the office chair, and eventually the ergonomic nightmare that defined modern work culture. We sit more than any generation before us, and yet, somehow, we're all exhausted. Anthropologists might one day label our era the Great Sitting Down. Still, there's something poetic about the journey. The chair began as a symbol of divine rule and ended as a universal right. A humble rectangle of wood and fabric shared by all. Every time we pull up a seat, we're performing a quiet act of rebellion against history's hierarchy. So the next time you sink into your favorite chair, remember, you're sitting in a throne thousands of years in the making. Design born from power, shaped by patience, and perfected by backs that refuse to suffer quietly. And if your chair creaks, smile. That's just the sound of democracy stretching. If you've ever complained about doing the dishes, take comfort. At least you have dishes. For most of human history, people ate from whatever surface was nearby. A flat stone, a hunk of bread, or most commonly, their own laps. Civilization, as it turns out, didn't begin with the wheel. It began when someone finally said, "I'm tired of stew running off my knees." Before plates eating was a communal affair, a glorious, greasy chaos. In prehistoric camps, families gathered around fires, sharing food directly from pots or spits. It was democratic, if unhygienic. Everyone ate with their hands, double-dipped without shame, and probably wiped their fingers on the nearest mammoth hide. The first plates were hardly elegant. Hollowed wood, bark, or dried leaves used to cradle small portions. In ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, people upgraded to clay bowls and bread trenchers. That's right, the earliest plates were edible. Diners tore off chunks of their makeshift plates to soak up sauce, leaving little for the dishwasher. Because there wasn't one. It was the original zero-waste lifestyle. The Greeks preferred shallow ceramic bowls, perfect for mixing wine, cheese, and philosophical arguments. The Romans took dining to imperial levels, introducing silver platters and bronze dishes engraved with scenes of gods who would have disapproved of how much they were eating. A Roman banquet was equal parts cuisine and performance. Couches, slaves, oysters, and at least one person quoting poetry mid-bite. But the Middle Ages, Europe, post-Rome, collectively forgot what table manners were. Meals returned to trenchers, thick slices of stale bread used as disposable plates. 2 or 3 people shared one, eating from opposite sides like awkward strangers at a date gone wrong. When the meal ended, the soggy trenchers were given to the poor or the dogs, sometimes both. Nothing says generosity like handing someone your gravy-soaked tableware. The table itself wasn't much better. In castles, it was literally a board laid across trestles, assembled only for meals and removed afterward. The phrase room and board comes from this. If you had a board to eat on, you were doing well. The idea of a permanent dining table came centuries later, once eating became less about survival and more about subtle social warfare. Around the 13th century, nobles began using metal or ceramic plates, objects that could be washed and reused, though hygiene was still mostly theoretical. These early table settings weren't standardized. Forks hadn't yet joined the party. They were still scandalizing priests, remember. So people ate with knives and fingers, wiping hands on tablecloths that were supposedly decorative. Wine flowed, dogs roamed underfoot, and someone inevitably lost a ring in the stew. Then came the Renaissance, and with it, the dawn of table manners. As trade brought fine ceramics from China and glassware from Venice, the upper classes discovered the joy of matching dishes. Suddenly, the table was a stage. Meals choreographed displays of wealth and restraint. Etiquette manuals taught nobles how to cut, sip, and dab politely. A 16th century guide advised, "Do not lick your knife, nor comb your hair with your fingers." A surprisingly necessary clarification. By the 17th century, dining had transformed into art. The French perfected service à la française. Lavish spreads of multiple courses served all at once, arranged symmetrically like edible architecture. Every guest had their own plate, napkin, and cutlery. It was revolutionary and exhausting. Servants scurried to replace every dish between courses. Dinner became theatre, and the table its stage. Plates evolved too. Porcelain became the material of choice, its luminous surface ideal for showing off sources and wealth alike. When Meissen in Germany cracked the Chinese porcelain secret in the 18th century, Europe went wild. Every noble family wanted monogrammed dinnerware, floral patterns, and gold rims so bright you could check your reflection mid-meal. For the less fortunate, pottery and pewter remained staples. Still, even a rough clay plate represented progress, a small, circular symbol of dignity. Having your own plate meant you mattered enough not to share saliva, a modest but meaningful step towards civilization. The table itself became the great equalizer and divider, a symbol of hospitality, family, and power. Kings held councils around them. Peasants gathered at them. Philosophers dined, scribes recorded, and revolutionaries planned over them. To have a seat at the table meant influence. To be left standing meant you were on the menu. Then came the 19th century, when industrialization mass-produced tableware for everyone. Factories churned out china, forks, and napkins by the millions. Middle-class families adopted rituals once reserved for nobility: Sunday dinners, tablecloths, polite conversation. Even the idea of setting the table became cultural shorthand for domestic respectability. Of course, modern life has since undone centuries of etiquette. We eat on couches, desks, dashboards, and beds. The plate has become optional, replaced by cartons, wrappers, and phones streaming shows about better diners than we'll ever be. The table has lost its sacredness, and yet we still build our lives around it, because in the end, the table isn't just furniture. It's where we gather, argue, celebrate, mourn. It's where we feed each other and, for a brief moment, remember that we're part of something shared. Every chipped plate and water ring is a fossil of connection. So next time you sit down to a meal, whether it's porcelain and silver or takeout on a laptop, pause for a second. Look at the surface beneath your food. That smooth, simple circle is the descendant of empires, revolutions, and bread crusts. It's proof that humanity, for all its chaos, still strives to make its mess beautiful. It's strange to think that civilization's march toward order might have begun with someone untangling their hair. But the comb, small, silent, and perpetually lost, has always been more than a grooming tool. It's been a symbol of control, purity, and the eternal human struggle against chaos, one strand at a time. The earliest combs date back over 5,000 years. Archaeologists have found them in Egyptian tombs, carved from ivory and boxwood, placed beside cosmetics and amulets. The message was clear. Even in the afterlife, bedhead was unacceptable. To the Egyptians, hair was spiritual, alive, an extension of the soul. To groom it was to bring harmony to the body, a tiny daily ritual against disorder. Those first combs were masterpieces, double-sided, with wide teeth for detangling and fine teeth for lice removal. Half beauty, half practicality. Every morning, as sunlight hit the Nile, someone somewhere began their day with a small sacred act, taming the wild into symmetry. Elsewhere, in ancient Mesopotamia, artisans carved combs from bone and horn, often decorated with animals or inscriptions. Combs were status symbols, gifts, heirlooms, even weapons in a pinch. The Bible mentions them too. Samson's downfall began with a haircut, not a sword. The act of grooming was never just cosmetic, it was mythic. Then came the Greeks and Romans, who took self-care to theatrical levels. Wealthy citizens kept slaves whose sole duty was hair maintenance. Oiled curls, elaborate braids, the occasional golden accessory. Hair was politics. A bad hair day could ruin your reputation faster than gossip. Roman women spent hours under the combs of specialists called ornatrices, whose entire careers were devoted to taming ambition into curls. But the comb had another quieter life. As an instrument of ritual, in temples and shrines across Asia and Africa, priests combed sacred animals before ceremonies, believing the act purified both body and spirit. In Japan, the comb, kushi, was a powerful charm. The word itself, written with characters meaning suffering and death, made it an object of both beauty and superstition. Brides used special combs on their wedding day to comb away misfortune. Meanwhile, samurai wore intricately carved wooden combs in their top knots. As much about discipline as style. By the Middle Ages, Europe had turned the comb into a weapon in its war against dirt and demons. Hygiene may have faltered, but vanity never does. Knights carried fine ivory combs engraved with prayers or love poems, pocket-sized reminders of order in a messy, bloody world. Monks, too, kept them, not for fashion, but for humility. To comb one's hair was to resist the Ichiwa, devil's favorite tactic, disarray. Of course, superstition crept in. Dropping a comb meant bad luck. Breaking one meant a quarrel. Combing your hair after dark could summon spirits. Combing it before bed could invite dreams of the dead. Mothers warned their children not to lend out combs. Personal energy was sacred, and to share it was to risk losing yourself. Somewhere between hygiene and mysticism, the comb became a talisman. Then, as always, the Renaissance turned utility into luxury. Combs were carved from tortoiseshell, silver, and coral. Some were inlaid with gemstones, others folded like tiny works of engineering. Ladies displayed them as jewelry, slipping them into elaborate updos. The comb had evolved from a tool to a statement, an ornament of civilization itself. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the invention of molded plastic made combs affordable for everyone. Suddenly, this symbol of purity and prestige was in every home, on every dresser, in every pocket. Soldiers carried combs to shave seconds off their morning routine. Barbers built entire empires around them. A single comb could serve generations, passed from father to son, soldier to sailor, always doing the quiet work of restoring order to the human condition. And yet, even as combs multiplied, they kept their magic. They're deeply personal objects, too intimate to borrow, too simple to notice until they're gone. Everyone has lost one. Everyone has bought another. The comb's invisibility is its power. It is civilization's most overlooked obsession, the one tool we all trust to put things right again. There's something profoundly human about that. The world may spin into madness, politics may crumble, phones may die. But every morning, someone somewhere still stands before a mirror, comb in hand, whispering to themselves, "Let's fix this." It's a tiny ritual, repeated billions of times, a moment of quiet defiance against entropy, a belief that no matter how tangled life gets, it can be smoothed, strand by strand, tooth by tooth. So when you next run a comb through your hair, think of the pharaohs, the monks, the samurai, and every anonymous hand that ever tried to make order out of chaos. You're not just grooming, you're participating in humanity's oldest therapy. Because in the end, civilization isn't built on laws or stone. It's built on the daily humble conviction that disorder can be managed, and that beauty, however fleeting, is always worth the effort. Imagine living in a world without windows, just four walls, a door, and the eternal choice between darkness and draught. That was humanity for thousands of years. The concept of inside, of separating ourselves from the world while still being able to see it, didn't truly exist until someone learned how to trap light in stone. And that miracle came from sand. Glass, that most delicate and defiant of materials, began as an accident somewhere around 2500 BCE. The story goes that Phoenician merchants cooking on the beach used blocks of natron, a kind of mineral soda, to prop up their pots. When the fire grew hot enough, the sand beneath melted into a shiny, translucent puddle. The merchant stared, probably said something unprintable, and the world's first glassmaker was born. At first, glass was rare and strange, a shimmering curiosity. Egyptians used it for beads and ornaments, not windows. It was colored, cloudy, and wildly expensive. A single small vessel might take weeks to make. Clear glass, the kind that actually let you see through, wouldn't arrive for another 2,000 years. Still, the fascination grew. The Romans, masters of borrowing good ideas, learned how to blow glass into thin, transparent sheets. Suddenly, sunlight could pass through walls. Wealthy citizens installed small panes in bathhouses and villas, not for insulation, but for bragging rights. To have light that didn't come from fire was the ancient equivalent of having Wi-Fi in the desert. Yet, like all good inventions, glass had a problem. It broke, constantly. Windows were fragile luxuries, easily shattered by weather, children, or poorly aimed stones. Most people stuck with oiled parchment, animal hides, or wooden shutters. Homes were dim, smoky, and perpetually drafty. Privacy and comfort were still opposites. Then came the Middle Ages, the era of divine architecture and questionable hygiene. Cathedrals rose stone by stone, and glass found its true purpose. Stained glass windows transformed sunlight into theology. Crimson saints, sapphire skies, and golden halos glowed through Gothic arches, telling stories to congregations who couldn't read. The church, always an excellent storyteller, realized something. Glass wasn't just decoration, it was revelation. While peasants shivered in windowless cottages, cathedrals bathed in holy radiance. Light became the language of God. To stand in Notre Dame or Chartres under those glowing mosaics was to believe, if only for a moment, that heaven had good interior design. But outside the church, glass remained elite. By the 14th century, glaziers in Venice perfected the art of making clearer, flatter glass. They built secret furnaces on the island of Murano, where glassmakers worked under threat of death if they shared trade secrets. Their creations, thin, even panes polished to brilliance, became so valuable they were treated like currency. Owning windows meant owning sunlight. The Renaissance spread glass beyond religion and royalty. Scholars installed windows in their studies. Painters learned to capture light through them. And suddenly, the indoors became a concept worth perfecting. The human desire for comfort evolved from mere shelter to aesthetic experience. The home began to breathe light. Then came the 17th and 18th centuries, when glass met architecture head-on. Palaces sprouted glass galleries and conservatories. The Château de Versailles gleamed with its hall of mirrors, an endless corridor of reflected light designed to make kings feel immortal and everyone else faint from envy. Glass was no longer just material, it was spectacle. But the true revolution came with the industrial age. Machines made glass cheaper, stronger, and bigger. Suddenly, sunlight belonged to everyone. Shop windows transformed cities into glowing theatres of consumption. Greenhouses fed nations. Trains and carriages rolled forward under glass panes, letting travellers watch the world race by without catching its dust. And with each pane installed, the modern idea of inside expanded. Windows turned houses into habitats for light. They separated us from wind, rain, and danger, yet kept us connected to beauty. They let us witness storms safely, sunsets privately, and mornings gently. The phrase, "a room with a view," became shorthand for paradise. Of course, not everyone loved it. Philosophers fretted that windows weakened the spirit, made people complacent, too content with comfort. "A man behind glass," one critic wrote in the 1800s, "forgets the world's bite." He wasn't entirely wrong. Glass both liberates and isolates. It's transparency with a price. Today, we live in boxes made almost entirely of glass. Skyscrapers gleam, cars glint, and phones, those pocket-sized obsessions, are little glass windows we stare through all day, forgetting there's a real world just beyond the reflection. The barrier between inside and outside has never been thinner or more confusing. Still, the symbolism endures. A window is more than an architectural feature. It's an act of optimism. Every time you open the blinds, you reenact an ancient miracle, letting light in without letting the world in. So tomorrow morning, when you stand before your window and watch the sun climb over the rooftops, remember what you're really looking at. A 5,000-year collaboration between fire, sand, and curiosity. A fragile invention that gave us warmth, vision, and privacy. A boundary that defines civilization itself. Because the moment we learned to let in the light but keep out the wind, we stopped merely surviving. If sight gave civilization walls and windows, then sound gave it order. Before clocks ticked, before loudspeakers barked, before your phone gently screamed, "Meeting in 5 minutes," there were bells, ringing, clanging, tolling, the original push notifications of the world. Humans have always trusted sound to tell them what to do. Long before cities had names, someone banged a rock against metal and everyone looked up. That, right there, was the birth of authority. The first bells weren't cast but improvised. Shells, hollow bones, or bits of bronze that rattled like distant thunder. In ancient China, bells were sacred long before they were practical. Around 2000 BCE, the Shang dynasty cast massive bronze bells called zhong, each tuned precisely to sing for the gods. They didn't swing. They were struck, one solemn note at a time, echoing across palaces and tombs. When these bells rang, heaven supposedly listened. Elsewhere, the Egyptians used handbells in temple ceremonies. The Greeks added them to chariots and banquets. And the Romans, never ones to miss a chance at drama, hung them in baths, markets, and brothels alike. A Roman bell could summon you to worship, dinner, or sin, sometimes in that exact order. Then came Christianity, and the bell truly found its voice. Early monks needed a way to summon brothers to prayer across sprawling abbeys. Yelling wasn't dignified, and messenger boys were unreliable, so they turned to bronze. The first church bells were small, struck by hand. By the 7th century, they grew into the giants that would one day tower over Europe, sanctifying every hour with sound. To medieval villagers, bells weren't just instruments. They were characters, loud, opinionated, occasionally ominous. Each had a name, a blessing, and a job. Some called for prayer, others warned of fire, storm, or plague. Their tolls measured life itself, birth, marriage, death, the soundtrack of existence in a minor key. When a bell rang, everyone stopped. Peasants crossed themselves, markets paused, thieves reconsidered. Even demons, it was said, fled from the sound of consecrated bronze. The church bell didn't just organize time. It organized fear, faith, and behavior. It was the voice of authority made audible. But bells weren't all solemnity and sanctity. In towns, they also marked fun. Fairs, feasts, coronations. Bells rang for victory and peace, for arrivals and departures. They were humanity's emotional barometer. One sound for mourning, another for celebration, yet both capable of making a crowd weep. Meanwhile, smaller bells went portable. Travelers wore them on horses and sleds to announce their presence. Merchants hung them at shop doors to alert owners of customers or thieves. The sound of commerce jingled through medieval streets long before advertising jingles existed. As the world industrialized, bells evolved from sacred to systematic. In factories, whistles replaced them, the shrill, unmistakable cry of modern discipline. When a steam whistle blew, thousands of workers moved as one, machines roared, and civilization's heartbeat grew mechanical. The sound that once called monks to prayer, now called men to work. Schools followed suit. The bell dictated every movement. Lessons began, lessons ended. Childhood was scheduled to the minute. The military adopted bugles and drums, turning sound into obedience. Even ships and trains used whistles to impose rhythm on the chaos of motion. The human ear, it seemed, had become the world's favorite leash. But sound also democratized power. In 19th century cities, public bells rang not for kings, but for fire alarms and warnings. They belonged to everyone, a collective voice of safety. When the Liberty Bell tolled in Philadelphia, it declared independence not by decree, but by echo. That cracked bronze relic remains one of the few instruments in history that made noise and silence at the same time. Even in our age of screens and vibrations, the legacy of bells and whistles lingers. Every notification ping, every ringtone, every alert is a descendant of those ancient clangs. They summon us, discipline us, annoy us, but they still carry the same authority. The sound says, "Look up, something matters." It's no accident that when we celebrate, we ring things, wedding bells, New Year's chimes, even the tiny ting of a champagne glass. Deep down, we still believe that sound can bless, that ringing can cleanse a space of silence and make it sacred, even if it's just your phone reminding you to breathe. And if you've ever stood near a great bell, say Big Ben in London, or Notre Dame's Emmanuel in Paris, you know the feeling. The air itself trembles. For a moment, you feel impossibly small and yet entirely connected. To history, to ritual, to everyone who ever looked up and thought, that sound means something. Because bells don't just measure time, they give it voice. So the next time your phone chimes, your doorbell rings, or your microwave beeps, remember, you're hearing a 4,000-year echo of the human desire to bring order to chaos. To tell the world, listen up, to turn silence into meaning. And even now, when the old church bells ring at dusk and their sound drifts over rooftops, they're not really calling anyone in particular. They're simply reminding us all, softly, endlessly, that we're still here and still listening. Today, jewelry means sparkle, status, beauty, indulgence, maybe a midlife crisis paid for in carats. But for most of history, it wasn't about fashion at all. Jewelry wasn't decoration, it was defense. Those glittering rings and amulets our ancestors wore weren't there to impress anyone. They were armor, charms against death, demons, and whatever mysterious forces made crops fail and babies cry. If you've ever slipped on a lucky ring, worn a sentimental necklace, or refused to take off that one bracelet during a bad week, congratulations, you're continuing a 10,000-year superstition. The oldest jewelry ever found, beads made from snail shells dating back over 100,000 years, wasn't exactly haute couture. They were protection. Each bead was a whispered prayer, a talisman against the unknowable. To wear one was to say, I belong to something larger than fear. In ancient Egypt, jewelry was practically divine technology. Gold wasn't just wealth, it was immortality. Pharaohs were buried dripping with it, convinced the sun metal would guide them through the afterlife. Scarabs symbolized rebirth, ankhs eternal life, and the Eye of Horus promised protection from every ill, from snake bites to gossip. Even peasants wore faience beads shaped like gods. Nobody left home without backup. The Mesopotamians agreed. Their amulets bore inscriptions like, "May Ishtar guard me," or "For the health of my liver." Apparently, the liver was very important. The Sumerians mixed lapis lazuli, carnelian, and gold, believing each material contained divine properties, courage, purity, wisdom. The result was ancient bling with user manuals. Then came the Greeks and Romans, who made jewelry the ultimate multitasker. Rings sealed contracts, pledged love, and doubled as personal brand logos. Soldiers wore intaglio rings carved with gods for protection. Merchants wore them for luck. Lovers wore them for regret. Romans even invented the signet ring, a combination of ID card, security system, and fashion statement. Lose it, and you didn't just misplace jewelry, you misplaced your authority. But jewelry's magic went beyond bureaucracy. Every culture poured belief into metal and stone. The Celts wore torques, heavy gold neck rings that symbolized divine power. The Vikings carved runes into silver bracelets to channel fate. In India, gemstones were, and still are, chosen for their planetary alignments. A cosmic insurance policy worn directly on your skin. And then there were the amulets, the wearable prayers of the world. Christians carried crucifixes, Jews wore tiny mezuzahs, Muslims inscribed verses of the Quran in pendants. Even those who renounced superstition still reached for tokens of faith when lightning struck. A chain, a charm, a coin. Something tangible to hold on to when the universe felt unpredictable. Of course, superstition had style. During the Renaissance, jewelers became half artist, half exorcist. They crafted talismans against the plague, emeralds to purify air, coral to ward off poison, rubies to detect illness by darkening in color. They never did, but it sounded convincing. The wealthy practically rattled with charms. Meanwhile, the poor wore iron rings or copper pennies for luck. Humbler materials, same logic. In the Middle Ages, people took things a little too far. They stuffed gemstones into wounds, swallowed gold leaf for health, and wore powdered pearl as makeup. Spoiler, none of this worked. Yet the faith persisted, not in science, but in symbolism. Jewelry bridged the physical and the spiritual. It let humans decorate their fear and call it faith. The Enlightenment tried to strip that magic away. Gemstones became geology, gold became commerce, but belief never fully left. Lovers still exchanged lockets with hair inside, small reliquaries of affection. Soldiers wore engraved pendants into war, whispering that the metal would catch bullets. And mothers still pinned charms on infants to guard against the evil eye, just in case reason was wrong. The Victorians revived jewelry's old purpose with theatrical flair. Mourning rings, jet brooches, and lockets filled with miniature portraits turned grief into wearable devotion. Every clasp, hinge, and engraving told a story. Remember me, protect me, forgive me. Even the dead, it seemed, deserved accessories. Then came modernity, and with it, sparkle without superstition. Or so we claim. Diamonds became forever. Brands replaced blessings, and amulets turned into logos. But scratch the surface of a Cartier charm or a friendship bracelet, and the old instinct is still there. To wear something that says, I'm safe, I'm seen, I'm loved. Anthropologists call jewelry portable identity. Psychologists might call it emotional armor. Either way, it's protection, not against spears or spirits, but against the vast anonymity of existence. Because deep down, we still believe what our ancestors did, that a small piece of beauty can keep the darkness out. So next time you clasp a necklace or slip on a ring, don't think of it as decoration. Think of it as an ancient spell. One cast in gold and memory, linking you to every soul who ever looked at the stars, whispered a hope, and decided to wear it. If you're lying in bed right now, congratulations. You're doing something profoundly historical. The bed is the most personal piece of furniture humanity ever invented. It's where we're born, where we dream, where we confess, and, eventually, where we die. Everything important in life either starts or ends under a blanket. And yet, for most of history, beds weren't cozy sanctuaries. They were statements of wealth, of status, of how seriously you took sleep, sin, and social climbing. Let's start in ancient Egypt, where beds were stiff, high, and shaped like rectangles of divine authority. Pharaohs slept on gilded wooden frames that looked more like small altars than furniture. The poor, meanwhile, used mats on the floor, though even those were neatly woven and sometimes elevated on bricks to deter snakes, because nothing says goodnight like venom prevention. The Greeks and Romans, ever dramatic, turned sleeping into an art form. They reclined on couches called clenae, which doubled as dining furniture. A proper Roman feast often ended with guests snoring in place, an early form of open concept living. Their mattresses were stuffed with wool, feathers, or, for the less fortunate, hay. Sleep wasn't sacred. It was just something that happened between banquets. Then came the Middle Ages, when beds became both fortresses and theatres. The wealthy slept in towering wooden constructions, part throne, part panic room. Curtains hung from all sides to keep out drafts, light, and servants with bad timing. In castles, the great bed was often placed in the main hall, where guests and attendants could see their lord slumbering like a horizontal monarch. Privacy was optional. Symbolism was not. For peasants, things were simpler. Straw pallets, shared spaces, and plenty of company. Entire families, sometimes including livestock, huddled together for warmth. The phrase "sleep tight" probably originated here, referring to the ropes that supported straw mattresses. Ropes that had to be tightened nightly so you didn't roll onto the floor mid-dream. Medieval people treated beds like sacred objects. They were blessed, inherited, and occasionally transported to new homes like heirlooms of intimacy. A good bed was often a family's most valuable possession. Marriages were consummated on them, babies delivered, oaths sworn. If you wanted to sign a contract that mattered, you did it in bed, which admittedly sounds more fun than a boardroom. And when you died, you stayed there too. The deathbed wasn't a metaphor, it was literal. Families gathered around the same frame that had seen your birth and your wedding, now serving as your exit stage. Beds were witnesses to entire lifetimes, creaking through every chapter. By the Renaissance, sleep went upscale. Mattresses grew thick and indulgent, stuffed with down and covered in velvet. Bed frames became architectural, carved with cherubs, columns, and family crests. To own a great bed was to prove you'd made it. The most famous, the Great Bed of Ware, built in 1590, could fit at least 8 people, and occasionally did. Travelers wrote about it in awe. It wasn't just a bed, it was social media before there was media. The 17th and 18th centuries refined the bed into a private stage of comfort. Curtains persisted, but now they whispered intimacy rather than isolation. Bedrooms became distinct rooms, not just corners. Sleep itself became respectable, something to cherish rather than endure. Poets began to write about dreaming as art. Doctors studied it as mystery. And furniture makers, ever opportunistic, discovered a new market for people who wanted to look elegant while unconscious. Then came the Industrial Revolution, which democratized comfort. Springs replaced ropes. Cotton replaced hay. Suddenly, even the middle class could own a bed that didn't double as a medieval siege engine. By the 20th century, mattresses had gone scientific. Coils, foam, latex, and marketing slogans promising orthopedic transcendence. The bed became a battleground for innovation, each decade more obsessed with comfort than the last. And yet, for all the progress, the symbolism never left. The bed remains the stage of our most human moments. Lovers whisper secrets there. Children hide from nightmares. Patients cling to consciousness. Dreamers build worlds that vanish with dawn. Even taxes can't escape it. In medieval England, a dying man's bed, literally the frame, was part of the estate to be taxed. It was wealth and mortality wrapped together. You might sleep soundly, but the crown always got its share of your dreams. Today, we worship the bed in subtler ways. We measure luxury by thread count, assign status to brand names, and build entire morning routines around refusing to leave it. Beds have become confessionals of exhaustion, sanctuaries of scrolling, temples of temporary escape. We love them because they hold the best and worst of us, the hopeful, the heartbroken, the barely awake. Every wrinkle in the sheets, every creak in the frame, is a memory recorded in silence. Generations have breathed into the same shape, a rectangle of fabric and faith. The bed has seen it all, judged nothing, and kept every secret. So tonight, when you sink into yours, take a moment. You're not just lying on a mattress. You're lying on the history of humanity's most intimate invention. The one place where we all surrender, where kings and beggars alike close their eyes and become equal. And if it groans beneath you, that's not wear and tear. That's applause. And now, here we are. The candle burns low, the world outside quiets, and you, brave traveler through time and trivia, have followed us from spoons to socks, from pyramids to pillows, from gods to glass. You've just spent the last 2 hours wandering through humanity's junk drawer, that cluttered, miraculous collection of everyday objects we take for granted. The things we touch 100 times a day without ever wondering why they exist or what secret lives they've lived before us. The truth is, civilization isn't built on kings or empires or grand inventions. It's built on the quiet persistence of ordinary things, the tools and trinkets that keep us human when everything else falls apart. A spoon that once fed pharaohs still stirs soup in your kitchen. A candle that once lit cathedrals now flickers on birthday cakes. A coin that once bought silence now jingles next to keys. The ghosts of empires live in your pockets and cupboards. These objects, the humble, the overlooked, the mundane, are time machines. They carry fingerprints older than memory. They whisper stories of people just like you. Tired, hopeful, messy, alive. Every item in your home, every gadget, every piece of furniture is a fossil of human ingenuity. A little monument to the idea that we can make life not just possible, but pleasant. Because that's really the story of us, isn't it? We took a dangerous world and padded it with comfort. We took chaos and arranged it into shelves and drawers. We took survival and added style. And even now, as you lie here drifting towards sleep, surrounded by inventions so common they've become invisible, the sheets, the pillow, the soft light in the corner, you're cradled by thousands of years of human trial and error. Every thread, every switch, every sound was once an experiment. Someone somewhere thought, what if we made this better? And they did. So maybe, the next time you pick up a pen, pour a drink, or pull a blanket over your shoulders, you'll feel that connection to all those invisible hands that came before, to the craftsmen, the dreamers, the nameless geniuses who left comfort as their legacy. And in that soft awareness, maybe you'll see what they saw, that progress isn't a straight line. It's 1,000 tiny stitches, stitches of curiosity and care, woven through the fabric of time. So close your eyes now. Listen to the quiet hum of modern life, the pipes, the clock, the soft rhythm of your own breathing. All of it, every sound, every object, every comfort, is proof that the world, for all its noise, has always been trying to take care of you. Sleep well among your inventions. You're surrounded by the miracles of the ordinary. And if you dream of ancient places, of clay tablets, candlelight, or glass cathedrals, don't be surprised. History never really ends. It just rearranges itself on the nightstand. Good night. And remember, there is nothing boring about the things that make us human.